The moment Ella Kingsley walked into Harding's barn on that sweltering August evening in 1883, every man in Millhaven, Texas, turned to look at her, and within the first 10 minutes, every last one of them had something to say about how she ought to be running her life. She had not asked for a single word of it. The gathering had been organized by Reverend Dale Purcell as a sort of welcome-back celebration, a community supper that doubled as a polite excuse for the good people of Millhaven to get a long look at the widow, who had returned after 3 years away in San Antonio. Ella was 26 years old, dark-haired, with green eyes that caught the lantern light like river glass, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had survived things that would have broken someone softer. She wore a deep blue dress that had cost her more than she would ever admit, and she carried herself with a composure that the men of Millhaven apparently read as an open invitation. The first to approach her was Harold Finch, who ran the feed store. He took her hand, pumped it twice, and said, without a breath of greeting first, "You ought to sell the Kingsley land before winter. Soil's gone dry and the price will only fall." He said it the way men said things when they believed that saying them was the same as doing a kindness. Ella smiled and said nothing beyond a polite thank you. Then came Pete Dawson, who was a rancher with a sunburned forehead and a habit of adjusting his belt buckle when he was about to say something he considered important. "Miss Ella," he said, using the old name like she was still 19, "you are going to need a foreman out there. A woman can't manage 40 acres alone. I know a man." He lowered his voice as though offering a secret. "My brother-in-law, not too proud to take direction mostly." She thanked him as well and moved toward the punch table. Near the punch table was Clem Hoover, who was 60 if he was a day, and who informed her that she should not be living out on the property alone because the Eastern Road had seen trouble, and a woman by herself was a temptation to the wrong sort of man. He meant this as wisdom. She accepted it as the thing it was. Dr. Alastair Prout found her by the peach preserves and told her she looked thin, that grief and travel did things to a woman's constitution, and that she ought to be eating red meat and sleeping 10 hours a night. He did not ask how she was sleeping. He told her. Judge Lester Taine, who was technically retired, buttonholed her near the window and said that her late husband's estate was not going to settle itself, and that she really ought to hire a proper solicitor from San Antonio because the local men were, in his opinion, largely incompetent. He then recommended a solicitor in San Antonio, which was, she noted, the city she had just left. By the time Ella reached the back of the barn where the chairs had been set out in loose rows for the musicians, she had been offered advice on her land, her finances, her health, her safety, her grief, her future marriage prospects, and the proper method for preserving summer corn. She stood with a glass of warm punch, her composure entirely intact, and she felt something she could not quite name. It was not quite exhaustion. It was something older and quieter. It was the feeling of being talked at for so long that you began to wonder if anyone in the room actually saw you at all. She looked out across the gathering. There were perhaps 60 people in that barn. The musicians were beginning to tune up near the hay bales, a fiddle and a banjo, and a man with a harmonica who appeared to be deciding whether he was committed to the evening. Children chased each other between the adults' legs. Women clustered at the long tables where the food was laid out, talking over each other with the easy overlapping language of people who had known each other a long time. Men stood in groups of 3 or 4, talking about cattle prices and the drought and the coming of the railroad to the county 2 towns east. And in the far corner, leaning against one of the great posts of the barn with a plate balanced in one hand, stood a man she did not recognize. He was tall, lean in the way that men who worked the land tended to be lean, all of it useful and nothing of it decorative. He wore a dark canvas coat over a plain shirt, and his hat was pushed back on his head so that his face was not hidden by it, the way some men hid their faces behind their hat brims, as if the brim were a door they could close. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that suggested he had not shaved in several days, and the look about him of a man who was thoroughly comfortable with himself in a crowd that was not paying him any attention. He was not paying her any attention either. In a room full of men who had been watching her from the moment she arrived, that was remarkable enough to be noticeable. But more remarkable still was that as the evening progressed and she moved through it accepting advice, deflecting concern, smiling at people who meant well and said too much, he simply continued to eat his plate of food and watch the musicians tune up, and he never once crossed the room to tell her anything at all. Ella found herself watching him the way you watched a strange weather front coming in from the west, not with alarm, with interest. She did not approach him that night. She talked to Martha Holloway, who was old enough to have known her mother and who asked real questions and listened to real answers. She ate a plate of food and listened to the fiddle player, who was better than she expected. She let Reverend Purcell say a few words about community and the grace of homecoming, and she clapped with everyone else. She left before the dancing started because she was genuinely tired from 3 weeks of travel and from the weight of being welcomed so thoroughly by people who seemed to have her whole future already planned out. But when she walked out of the barn into the warm Texas night, she glanced back once, involuntarily, and found the tall man in the corner exactly where she had left him. He was looking at the musicians now, and there was something almost peaceful about the quality of his attention. She walked home through the dark with the sound of the fiddle fading behind her, and she thought about that. Her property was a 40-acre homestead 2 miles east of town, set back from the road by a stand of live oak that her grandfather had planted before her father was born. The house was a proper frame house, bigger than a settler's cabin but not grand by any measure, with a wide front porch that looked out over the flat land toward the distant line of hills. There was a well, a root cellar, a small stable, and a barn that was in better shape than the house itself. She had left it 3 years ago when her husband, Thomas Kingsley, died of a fever that took him in a week and left her with a property she did not know how to manage and a grief she did not know what to do with. She had gone to San Antonio to her cousin's household, and she had worked as a seamstress, and she had learned a great deal about herself in those 3 years. Among the things she had learned was that she was not a woman who could live in a city forever. She needed the land. She needed the particular quiet of the Texas plain at first light, when the world was all gold and blue and nothing had been decided yet. She had come back to manage her own affairs. She had come back to decide things for herself. She did not need anyone to tell her how. The next morning she rode into town on her bay mare, Rosa, and stopped at Harding's Mercantile for supplies. She was comparing flour prices when she heard a voice behind the counter say something to a man about fence posts, and when she looked up, she found the man from the barn. He was talking to old George Harding about a specific kind of wire staple that Harding apparently did not stock but could order. The man was patient about it. He did not make Harding feel bad for not having the thing. He just said he would come back in when the order arrived, and he thanked Harding by name, and then he turned to leave and nearly walked directly into Ella, who had drifted closer without quite meaning to. He stopped immediately. He was even taller than she had estimated in the dim barn, and his eyes in the daylight were a clear, even gray that struck her as unusual in the brown and gold landscape of Texas summer. "I apologize," he said. "No harm done," she said, and that was it. He moved past her to the door and was gone. Ella stood holding her flour scoop and told herself she was being ridiculous, and then went back to comparing prices. But she asked George Harding, with the studied casualness of a woman who was absolutely not doing what she was doing, who the man was. Harding was pleased to know something she did not. "That's Emmett Easton," he said. "Bought the old Callaway place last spring, up north end of the county near the creek bend. He runs cattle, keeps mostly to himself. Good man as far as I can tell, pays his debts and doesn't start trouble. Around here that puts you near the top of the list." Ella nodded and made no further comment. Emmett Easton. The name suited him somehow, solid, not decorative. She thought about him on and off for the next several days, which annoyed her, because she had more than enough to occupy herself. The house needed a new window sash on the east side where the wood had warped. The well rope needed replacing. She had a meeting with the bank regarding Thomas's estate, which had been left in a partial tangle because Thomas had been a good man and a decent farmer but a dismal record-keeper. She had beans to plant, although late-season beans were a gamble, and she had made her peace with gambling. The bank meeting was with a man named Harmon Welch, who was polite in the way that men were polite when they were explaining something complicated to someone they did not expect to understand it. He told her that the land was clear of debt, which was good, but that Thomas had entered into a verbal agreement with a neighboring rancher, a man named Charles Aldridge, regarding water rights for the creek that ran along the property's northern edge. Without documentation, the agreement was technically unenforceable, but Aldridge was asserting it anyway, and Welch seemed to feel that the easiest solution was for Ella to sell Aldridge the northern 5 acres and put the whole thing to rest. Ella listened to all of it. She asked a number of precise questions that Welch had not expected and could not fully answer. She thanked him for his time and told him she would think it over. Walking out of the bank into the hard afternoon sun, she nearly collided with Emmett Easton for the second time in 4 days. He was tying his horse at the rail. He looked up when she came through the door, and she saw the moment of recognition cross his face, which was not much of an expression but was something. "Mr. Easton," she said, because she knew his name now and it would be stranger not to use it. He looked slightly surprised, which she found satisfying. "Ma'am," he said. Then, with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than social obligation, he said, "You're the one who came back to the Kingsley place." "I am Ella Kingsley," she said. "Yes." He nodded slowly as though confirming something. He did not tell her that the Kingsley place needed work, though she suspected he knew it did. He did not tell her it was a lot to take on alone. He did not tell her anything at all. "I'm Emmett Easton," he said. "I have the place up near the creek bend." "I know," she said. "George Harding told me." The corner of his mouth moved very slightly. "Did he tell you what a fine establishment this bank is as well?" "He said it was adequate," she said. His exact word was adequate. "High praise," said Emmett Easton, and the small almost smile became something closer to a real one. She found herself smiling back before she had made any decision to do so. "I expect it is. Good afternoon, Mr. Easton." "Good afternoon, Miss Kingsley." She walked to her horse and rode home, and the afternoon sun was very bright and the road was very straight, and she had a great deal to think about that had nothing to do with water rights. The water rights situation, however, did not go away simply because she was not thinking about it. Charles Aldridge sent his foreman to her door 3 days later with a letter that was politely worded in the way that only aggressive things are politely worded. The letter said that Aldridge had an arrangement with the late Mr. Kingsley, and that he had in good faith been directing his herds to water at the northern creek crossing for 2 years, and that he considered the understanding binding in spirit if not in law, and that he trusted she would honor her late husband's commitments. Ella read the letter twice. She folded it and set it on the kitchen table and made herself a cup of coffee and drank it looking out the east window at the live oaks, which were dusty from the summer heat but alive. She was not going to sell him the 5 acres. She was not going to fight him in court either if she could help it, because courts cost money and time and she had limited amounts of both. What she needed was a proper survey of her water rights and a clear legal position, and she needed it without paying through the nose for a San Antonio solicitor. She needed someone who knew the land and the law as they applied to creek rights in this county specifically. She asked Martha Holloway, who knew everything about everyone, and Martha thought about it and said, "You might talk to Emmett Easton. He had something similar with a man named Briggs last autumn. Handled it himself without lawyers. I don't know the details, but Briggs backed off, so it must have gone well enough." Ella considered this for 2 days. She did not want to go to a man for help, which was not stubbornness but rather a finely calibrated wariness born from experience. Every time she had gone to a man for help in the past year, Help had arrived wrapped in the assumption that he now had some claim on her decisions. She did not want advice. She wanted information, and information was different. She rode to the Calloway place, Easton's place now, on a Thursday morning when the sky was high and blue and the heat had not yet built to its midday ferocity. The property was north of hers by 3 miles, and she could see from the road that he had put real work into it. The fences were sound. The outbuildings were repaired. There was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that showed someone had paid attention to soil and water. He was in the yard when she arrived, mending a piece of harness with the focused patience of a man who was good with his hands. He looked up when he heard her horse, and he stood, and he did not look surprised. "Miss Kingsley," he said. "Mr. Easton," she said, and dismounted cleanly and tied Rosa to the post by the fence. "I heard you had some trouble last year with a water rights dispute. I have one of my own, and I would like to know how you handled it if you are willing to tell me." He looked at her for a moment without speaking, which she had already noticed was a thing he did. He did not rush to fill silences with words, the way most people did. "Come sit on the porch," he said. "I'll get coffee." She sat in the shade of his porch, and he brought 2 cups out and sat across from her. And he told her, plainly and without editorializing, what had happened with Briggs and the creek, and what the resolution had been. He explained the specific provision in Texas water law as it had been codified in 1876 that protected riparian rights for property owners along a waterway. And he told her about the county surveyor, a man named Art Pickett, who was honest and reasonably priced, and who had drawn up the documentation that ended the Briggs situation. He said none of this as though she needed it explained. He said it the way he would say it to anyone who had asked a question directly and completely without condescension. When he was done, she said, "So you believe Aldridge has no legal standing?" "Based on what you've described, no," he said. "A verbal arrangement with a previous owner doesn't bind the current owner under Texas property law as it stands. Aldridge probably knows that. He's testing you." "Because I'm a woman," she said. He did not try to soften it or redirect it. "Yes," he said. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "Thank you," she said. "This is genuinely helpful." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was careful and also honest, a combination she was not used to. "You're going to be all right out there," he said, and then, before she could react to that, he added, "Not because I'm telling you so, because you clearly already know how to ask the right questions. That's most of it." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the live oaks at the edge of his property, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly sweet she could not identify. "Most men would not have said it that way," she told him. "What way?" "The way that credits me rather than themselves." He thought about that. "I suppose that's true," he said, without any particular pride or apology in it. Just acknowledgement. She finished her coffee. She thanked him again, and she rode home, and she hired Art Pickett to survey her water rights, and 3 weeks later she had documentation that was clear and legal, and which she sent to Charles Aldridge's attorney without a word of softening attached to it. Aldridge did not respond immediately, and she let him take his time because she had time. What she did not have, it turned out, was the ability to stop thinking about Emmett Easton. It was not like the feeling she'd had when she first met Thomas, which had been warm and comfortable, like walking into a room that smelled of baking bread. This was different. This was the feeling of wanting to understand something, of encountering a landscape she had not seen before and wanting to walk into it and find out what was in it. He came to her place about 2 weeks after her visit to his, without announcement, on a morning when she was trying to fix the window sash, and not doing especially well at it, because she had the right instinct but not quite the right tools. She heard a horse on the road and looked up and saw him come down her lane, and her first reaction was something uncomplicated and warm which surprised her into practicality. "Mr. Easton," she called from the ladder, "I'd ask you in for coffee, but I appear to be committed to this window." He looked at the window and then at her and then at the tools laid out on the porch below her. "Do you have a proper plane?" he asked. "I have what I have," she said. "I have a proper plane," he said. "I'll get it." He went back to his horse and produced a jointing plane from his saddlebag, which suggested he had either anticipated this problem or was simply the sort of man who carried useful things. He handed it up to her and she put it to the warped wood and felt immediately the difference between the right tool and the wrong one. The sash came true in 20 minutes. He did not climb the ladder. He did not take the plane back and do it himself. He simply handed it up and then stood below, and she got the distinct impression he was there in case the ladder shifted, not because he doubted she could manage the plane. When she came down, she made coffee and they sat on the porch and talked. It was an easy conversation, which was surprising because she had half expected it to be awkward, the way conversations with people you had been thinking about too much tended to be. But Emmett Easton was not a man who created awkwardness. He talked about his cattle, about the drought and its likely duration, about a book he had been reading, a collection of essays by a naturalist named Thoreau, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who read because he wanted to think, not because he wanted to seem like the sort of person who read. She told him about San Antonio, about the work she had done there, about what it was like to spend 3 years in a city when your bones were made for open ground. He listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said. When she finished a thing, he would respond to the thing she had actually said, not to the version of it he had already decided she meant. She thought, "This is remarkable and very simple, and I do not understand why it is so rare." Aldrich sent a second letter 2 weeks after she sent the survey documentation. This one dropped the politeness entirely. He said the arrangement had been understood by the community and that he would pursue the matter in court if necessary. His attorney, a man named Fowler, was apparently the aggressive kind. Ella brought the letter to Emmett when she happened to see him at the mercantile, and he read it without comment and then said, "Fowler likes to threaten and settle. He's done it 3 times in this county that I know of. You hold your position and you document everything." "I intend to," she said. "Do you want company when Aldrich's men come out again?" he asked. "They likely will." She considered this carefully. "Not because I can't handle it," she said. "No," he agreed. "Because a witness is useful." "Then yes," she said. "Thank you." He came by 2 days later when Aldrich's foreman, a man named Holt, rode up with 2 cowhands and the particular energy of men who had been sent to make someone feel small. Emmett was there, sitting on her porch steps in a completely relaxed posture, and she was standing on the porch itself. And when Holt made his speech about how Mr. Aldrich was a patient man but patience had limits, Ella responded with a precise and documented recitation of her legal position. She did not raise her voice. She did not waver. Emmett said nothing at all during the exchange, but his presence was, she realized, itself a kind of statement, not a threat. Just the visible fact that she was not alone, that someone had chosen to stand in her corner, and that someone was a man that even Holt, who was large and knew it, looked at with a certain professional assessment. When Holt and his men left, Emmett turned to her and said, "Well done." "Thank you for being here," she said. "I wasn't doing much," he said. "You were doing exactly the right amount," she said, and the way she said it made him look at her, and the look lasted a moment longer than was strictly conversational. She looked back. That was the beginning of something that neither of them named for several more weeks, which was partly restraint and partly the natural rhythm of 2 people who had both been hurt before and had learned to move carefully. Emmett had been married. She learned this in the piecemeal way you learned things about a private person, a fragment here and a reference there, and eventually it assembled itself into a picture. He had come to Texas from Missouri 4 years ago, after his wife Margaret died in childbirth, along with the child. He had come west because he needed somewhere that did not contain the shape of everything he had lost, and he had bought the Callaway place and worked it and built it up and lived quietly and mostly alone. He told her this himself, one evening in September, when she had ridden up to see how his north pasture fence was holding after a thunderstorm had come through and knocked some of hers flat. They were leaning on his pasture fence in the gold late afternoon light, and it came out in the natural course of the conversation, the way things came out between two people who were learning to trust each other without making a ceremony of it. "I'm sorry," she said, simply. Because she knew what it was to lose someone suddenly, to have the future fold itself shut like a book, and there was nothing more useful to say than that. "It was 4 years ago," he said. "It's not gone, but I am not swallowed by it." "No," she said, "I know what you mean." He looked at her in the amber light. "Thomas Kingsley," he said, not a question. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He would have been good to grow old with. I am sorry we did not get the chance." "You talk about him honestly," Emmett said. "Most people don't." "I see no point in doing otherwise," she said. "He was real, it was real. It does not unreal because he is gone." He was quiet for a long moment. The pasture was gold and long, and the cattle were moving slowly in the distance, and the sky was turning colors that did not have names. "I like the way you see things," he said. It was a simple sentence, and he said it simply, but she felt it land somewhere specific, somewhere that had been braced for impact for a long time. "I like the way you say things," she told him, "without the extra." He smiled, and it was the real smile, not the small, almost one. She had seen the real one perhaps 3 times by then, and she was keeping an informal count, because she had decided she liked it and wanted to know when she had seen it. She rode home in the dark with the stars coming out over the flat land, and she thought, "I am falling in love with Emmett Easton, and I am not afraid of it, which is itself remarkable, because I have been afraid of most things for a long time." October came to the county in a wash of cool air, and the smell of dried grass, and something on the wind that hinted at what was coming when winter decided to arrive. The trees in the creek draws went gold, and the light changed the way it did in autumn, taking on a horizontal quality that made everything look as though it were being lit from the inside. Ella's beans had come in better than expected, and she had put up more than she needed and brought jars of them to Martha Holloway, who received them with the direct and unsentimental gratitude of a woman who had lived too long to waste time on false modesty about what was useful. Martha, over a cup of tea that was significantly better than what most people in Millhaven served, looked at Ella with the frank eyes of a woman who had been watching people for 70 years and said, "You are not telling me what's actually occupying you." Ella smiled. "I am not, no." "Is it the Aldridge business?" "Aldridge I can handle," Ella said. "His attorney sent a final letter last week, and I believe they are finished. The survey was too clear." "Then it's Emmett Easton," Martha said without inflection. Ella looked at her. "I am old," Martha said. "I'm not blind. Half the county has noticed he rides your road more often than his cattle require." "He's been helpful," Ella said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and she suspected Martha knew it. "He's a good man," Martha said. "I knew his type before I knew him. The quiet kind. The ones that work things out inside their own heads before they say a word. They are slower to love, but they are thorough about it when they get there." Ella thought about that later, riding home. Thorough. It was the right word for Emmett. Everything he did was thorough. His fences, his harness repairs, the way he listened, the way he was careful with the things that mattered. She wondered if he was working something out inside his head. She suspected he might be. He asked if he could call on her, formally and without elaboration, on a Friday morning in late October. He had stopped by to return a hand drill he had borrowed, and she had been on the porch shelling the last of the summer pecans, and he had sat on the step while they talked, and then he had stood to leave, and then he had turned back and said, "I would like to call on you. If you are open to that." She had looked at him for a moment. "What does that mean to you?" she asked. "Calling on me." He thought about this, which she appreciated, because another man would have answered immediately with whatever he thought she wanted to hear. "It means I want to spend more time with you," he said, "and I want to do it honestly so that we both know what it is." "What is it?" she asked. "I think you're extraordinary," he said. "I have thought so since the night of the Harding barn gathering, when you managed that entire room of men telling you what to do without losing your composure or your dignity. I thought that was one of the more impressive things I'd seen." She was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that," she said. "I noticed that I was the only man there who didn't go over and tell you what to do," he said. "I don't know if that counts for anything." "It counted for a great deal," she said, more honestly than she had intended. "It was the first thing I noticed about you." The silence between them was warm and specific, not the formless kind. "Then yes," she said, "call on me." He called on her the following Sunday, and they rode out together along the creek that bordered her northern property, the one that Aldridge had spent so much time fussing over. The water was low but running, and the banks were draped in cottonwood trees that had gone full gold, and the light came through them at an angle that was almost ecclesiastical. They rode without hurry, talking sometimes and not talking other times, and both the talking and the not talking were comfortable. He brought her a book 2 weeks later, the Thoreau essays he had mentioned. He handed it over at the door with the directness of a man giving something real without making too large a gesture of it. "I thought you might find it worthwhile," he said. "He writes about being alone in a way that is not pitying." She read it in the evenings over the following week, and she found that Emmett had marked 3 passages with small pencil lines in the margins. She read those passages with particular attention, and she thought she understood something from them about the interior life of the man who had marked them. She wrote her own response to those passages in the margins next to his lines, and she returned the book to him with all of it left in there, and she watched his face when he opened it and saw her writing alongside his. "We should have a conversation about these," he said. "Whenever you are ready," she said. He came back 3 days later and they sat at her kitchen table and had that conversation, and it ran for 3 hours and ranged from philosophy to the specific mechanics of dry farming to the question of what made a life worth living and what was lost and what was not. She had not had a conversation like that in years. She was not sure she had ever had exactly that conversation, where she could say the actual thing she thought and not the softened version of it, and have it received and argued with and agreed with and built upon. She felt afterward the way you felt after a very good night's sleep, or after exercise when the body has been used honestly whole and capable and pleasantly tired. November came. The first real cold arrived with it, the kind that made the morning fires necessary and the evening ones welcome. Emmett had begun calling on her twice a week with the regularity of a man who had made a decision and was honoring it. He fixed her porch step, which had begun to give, not because she had asked him to, but because he noticed it and she let him, which was itself a new kind of trust, letting someone do something for you without it feeling like a claim. She cooked for him one Friday evening and they ate at the table in the warm lamplight, and the meal was simple, a venison stew and cornbread and the last of the peach preserves, and it was one of the best evenings she could remember. Not because anything large happened, because everything small happened instead. He helped her clear the plates without being asked, and they washed up at the basin side by side, their arms occasionally brushing, and the warmth of that casual proximity was so significant it felt almost bold. He left at a respectable hour because he was a man who cared about her reputation in Millhaven, not because he had been told to care about it, but because he understood that her life here was her own construction and he would not knock pieces off it carelessly. Standing at the door in the cold, he said, "I'll come Sunday." "Yes," she said, "come Sunday." He looked at her in the lamplight from inside, the warm gold of it falling across the porch, and something passed between them that was not said and did not need to be. The next Sunday was clear and cold and beautiful, the sky a hard deep blue with a few clouds moving fast across it from the northwest. He came in the morning and they rode out again, this time north and east, past her property line and into the open country that was not yet anyone's, the broad rolling land that was still the kind of empty that felt abundant rather than desolate. They stopped at the top of a low rise and looked out at it all, the land rolling away in every direction, brown and gold and pale green where the grass came back after the rain, and the distant line of hills smoky blue on the horizon. "I love this country," she said. It was not a complicated statement. It was simply true. "So do I," he said. "It took me a while to love it the way I do now. When I came here, I was just running away from somewhere else. And now I am running toward," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, and then he turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were very direct and honest, the gray of them picking up the color of the sky. "Ella," he said. She had noticed he did not often use her name, and when he did it had a particular weight. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had said yet, but she said it anyway, because she had already decided. He reached out and took her gloved hand in his, carefully, the way you handled something you recognized as valuable. They stayed on that rise for a long time, saying things and not saying things, and all of it was true. They were not reckless about it. They were deliberate, the way two people are deliberate when they have both been broken before and know what breaking costs. He did not rush. She did not hold back from fear. They found a pace that was theirs. He told her he loved her on a December evening in her kitchen, with the wood stove lit and the wind coming hard out of the north, and the lamp turned low to save the oil. He said it simply, the way he said everything, without decoration, without hedging, in the clear, plain voice of a man who had decided what was true. "I love you," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I'm telling you because it's true, and I believe in telling the truth." She had been standing at the stove, and she turned around and looked at him, and the feeling in her chest was large and warm and also very still, the way a lake was still after a storm. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen, and she thought, this is the moment, and she was right. He kissed her, and it was not a tentative or a performed thing. It was a real kiss, the kind that meant exactly what it said, and she put her hand against the side of his face and felt the roughness of his jaw and the warmth of his skin, and she thought that this was the thing she had not known she was waiting for until she had it. The county, of course, had opinions. Millhaven was not a large town, and two people whose horses were frequently seen at each other's properties were not going to go unnoticed. The opinions were largely benign. Martha Holloway was openly pleased and said so, and Reverend Purcell made a comment at church about the grace of new beginnings that was clearly directed at the two of them, which made Emmett's jaw tighten slightly in the way it did when he was trying not to react. Harold Finch told Emmett, over drinks at the saloon one evening, that he really ought to be careful, that a widow with property was a complicated situation legally, and he should see a solicitor before things went too far. Emmett thanked him and did not change anything. Pete Dawson told Ella that she was making a fine choice, but that she ought to make sure to have the property deed looked over carefully so that her rights were protected, and that he knew a man in Austin who could handle the paperwork. Ella thanked him and told him she had her own solicitor, which she did. Even Dr. Prout found a way to insert himself, patting Emmett on the shoulder at the mercantile, and saying that it was good for a man to have a purpose, and that clearly Miss Kingsley was doing Emmett a world of good because he looked significantly less gray around the eyes. Emmett told her all of this over dinner one night, and she started laughing, quietly at first and then fully, and he watched her laugh with an expression of complete helpless affection. "The world has many opinions," she managed. "The world should mind its business," he said, but he was smiling. "The world never has," she said. "We just don't have to listen to it." January was the hardest month because it was the month of the bad storm. It came out of the northwest on a Thursday night, a norther that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in 8 hours and brought ice behind it, the kind of ice that brought fences down, and animals that were not sheltered to their knees and sometimes worse. Ella was alone when it hit, and she was not unprepared. She had wood laid in and her animals secured, but the cold was vicious, and the ice made the well-roped seize in the casing, and she spent 2 hours in the dark before she had the water situation resolved. Emmett arrived at first light on Friday, materialized out of the gray ice fog, ice on his coat and his horse's mane, and the look on his face when she opened the door was a controlled version of something much less controlled. "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm all right," she said. "Come inside, you're frozen." She fed him coffee and food, and he was quiet for most of it, and she watched his face and understood that something was happening in him that was not quite ready to be spoken yet. She waited. "When I couldn't get out until this morning," he said finally, "I spent all night not knowing how things were here." "I know," she said gently. "I don't want to not know," he said. "I'm not making a speech about it. I'm just telling you that I don't want to be in a position where I spend nights not knowing if you're all right." She looked at him across the table. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He held her gaze. "I'm getting to it," he said. "I'm just not sure I've done it gracefully enough yet." "You're doing fine," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Ella," he said, "will you marry me?" She had known it was coming for months. In the way you knew a summer storm was coming, you could feel it in the air, a change in pressure, something building toward itself. She had thought about what she would feel when it arrived. She had expected something complex, some mixture of gladness and grief and the accumulated weight of caution. What she felt was very simple. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Outside, the ice was beginning to melt from the fence posts as the sun came up proper, and the whole world was briefly made of light. They were married in March, when the weather had broken and the first things were coming up green through the brown ground. Reverend Purcell officiated, and the wedding was held at Ella's property rather than in the church, which suited both of them. Martha Holloway was there, and George Harding and his wife, and a handful of other people who had been kind to one or both of them, and a cousin of Emmett's named Daniel who had ridden 3 days from San Marcos, and who had the same quality of quiet as Emmett, but a more elaborate sense of humor. Ella wore her good blue dress, the same one she had worn to Harding's barn gathering, because she had decided she liked the symmetry of it. Emmett wore his best coat, which was a proper wool coat she had not seen before, and he had shaved, and his hair was cut, and when he turned around and saw her coming across the yard toward him, his expression was so completely and helplessly open that she felt tears come to her eyes, which surprised her, because she did not cry easily. They said the words. They were serious and sincere, and also, she thought, deeply meant. Martha Holloway cried, unashamedly, and then told everyone around her that she was perfectly fine, and that they should look at the ceremony and not at her. Afterward, there was food and the fiddle player from the barn gathering, who turned out to be a friend of Emmett's from his early days in Texas, and who played extremely well when given enough good food and a generous audience. There was dancing, and Emmett, who she had not expected to dance, danced plainly without self-consciousness, the way he did most things. He held her close when they danced, and she felt the warmth of him and the solidness of him, and she thought about the night of the gathering, that first night when she had been standing in a room full of men with advice, and she had looked across it and found one man who was simply watching the musicians with a kind of peace. She had known even then, she thought, not his name, not the particulars, but the quality of him, that there was something different there. She had been right. They moved his things to her place, because her house was larger and her land was where she had put down her roots, and Emmett accepted this without complication. He brought his furniture and his tools and his cattle and his horse, and his book of Thoreau essays with her writing in the margins beside his, and that last thing she found sitting on the kitchen shelf one morning, and she stood looking at it for a long time. They combined the properties in practical terms, running the cattle on both parcels, and the creek that Aldridge had wanted became one of their most useful assets. Aldridge himself had gone quiet after the survey documentation, and in the spring he sold his ranch to a family from Georgia and left the county entirely. Ella heard this from Martha without particular triumph. She did not need triumph. She needed the land to be hers, and it was. The spring and summer of 1884 were the best she could remember. The rains came reasonably, and the cattle did well, and the kitchen garden, which was now significantly expanded because Emmett had good instincts about soil, produced more than they could eat and enough to sell and trade. She sewed and mended for a few families in town, the way she had in San Antonio, but by choice and on her own terms, not from necessity. Emmett had a way of being in a house with her that she had not known was possible, which was that he could be in it without filling all the space. He was comfortable with silence. He was comfortable with her having her own thoughts. He would sit and read in the evening while she wrote letters or mended, and they would talk when they wanted to and not talk when they did not, and neither silence nor conversation felt like a performance. She told him once that she had not known what it felt like to live alongside someone rather than beneath the weight of someone's concern for you, and he had looked at her with a kind of careful attention. Thomas wasn't unkind, she said quickly, because she was fair-minded about the dead. But he worried. He worried about me, and the worry had a weight. Worrying is easy, Emmett said. It doesn't require you to actually trust the person. She looked at him. That's exactly it, she said. I trust you, he said, completely. I'd be a fool not to. She reached across and took his hand where it rested on the table, and he turned his palm up and held hers. That autumn she was certain she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning over breakfast, directly, the way she did things, watching his face. His face did what his face rarely did, which was show everything at once. She saw the grief that lived in him still, the shadow of Margaret and the child lost, and she saw it move through him quickly and be followed by something else entirely, a warmth and a hope that were not guarded but were enormous and real. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was careful, but his eyes were not. "I am very well," she said. "I feel extraordinary, actually." He stood up from the table and came around to her, and she stood too, and he held her for a long moment with the morning light coming through the east window, and she could feel his heart beating. "I'm frightened," he said honestly, "and I'm more glad than I have words for." "Both things at once," she said. "Yes." "Good," she said. "That's the correct response." He laughed, and she felt it in his chest, and she held on to him in the warm kitchen, in the good light. She had a relatively smooth pregnancy by the standards of the time, though the winter of it was difficult. She was tired in ways she had not been before, and her back ached. Emmett did more of the heavy work without making any kind of issue of it. Martha Holloway came out twice a week. Dr. Prout was less insufferable than usual, which she attributed to the fact that he had a genuine professional interest in obstetric health and was, underneath the condescension, a competent physician. The child was born in June of 1885, on a morning when the sunrise came in colors so extreme they seemed impossible, orange and deep rose and gold, and Emmett paced the porch in the early light while Martha and the doctor attended Ella inside. She heard him pacing. It made her feel, oddly, less alone with the pain, not because she needed him there, but because knowing he was within earshot of her was its own kind of comfort. Their son arrived with a considerable complaint about the world, which made Dr. Prout's face relax into something like joy, and Martha laugh out loud. She named him James. James Thomas Easton Thomas for the man she had loved first, and Emmett's own father's name was James, and she had made the decision about both names herself, and told Emmett what she had decided. He had not said a word for a moment, and then he had said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "That's a good name." James Thomas Easton was a square, loud, determined child from the very beginning, with Emmett's gray eyes and Ella's dark hair, and a personality that was clearly going to be entirely his own. He liked to be held, but also liked to watch everything that was happening around him, looking up at faces and the ceiling and the lamplight with the focused attention of someone who had arrived with a purpose. Emmett held him on the first evening, when Ella was sleeping from sheer exhaustion, and she woke briefly to find Emmett sitting in the chair by the window in the last of the summer light, the baby settled against his chest, his hand spanning the baby's entire back. He was not doing anything. He was just being there, entirely present in a way that required nothing of her. She closed her eyes again and slept deeply, without fear. The years built themselves one upon the other the way good years did, without drama, but with an accumulation of things that mattered. James grew from a loud, determined baby into a loud, determined small boy who followed his father everywhere, and who had his mother's habit of looking at things until she understood them. He was neither angelic nor troublesome, but was, Ella thought, genuine, which was the thing she most hoped for. In the summer of 1887, when James was 2, and the ranch had expanded to include a third pasture leased from a neighbor who was moving to California, Ella became aware that she was expecting again. She told Emmett in the same direct way she had told him about James, and this time the fear on his face was smaller and the joy was larger, the proportion having shifted the way it did when something has happened once already and proven survivable. "Are you well?" he asked, same question, because some questions were worth asking every time. "Entirely," she said. Their daughter was born in March of 1888, during a week of warm rain that turned the live oaks bright green overnight and made the whole world smell of water. She arrived far more quietly than her brother had. She arrived, as Emmett said with a smile, like she had decided this was acceptable and was prepared to proceed. They named her Clara Rose, because Ella liked Clara and Emmett's mother had been Rose, and neither of them made any particular negotiation about it, but simply said the names aloud together and agreed that they fit. Clara Rose Easton had her father's stillness from the start and her mother's eyes, green and watchful and missing very little. She and James established, within about 6 months, a relationship that was equal parts devoted and exasperating, as siblings tended to be. Millhaven grew in those years, the way small Texas towns grew in the 1880s, with the railroad pushing closer and new families coming in. There was a school now, a proper one in a frame building on the south end of town, with a schoolteacher named Miss Ford who was from Ohio and who was, Ella thought, one of the most competent people she had met, managing a room full of varying ages with a combination of genuine warmth and absolutely no tolerance for foolishness. Ella and Miss Ford became friends in the way that women who respected each other's intelligence became friends, which was to say thoroughly and permanently. The Aldridge water rights situation became a kind of legend in the county, told at community gatherings as an example of something, the particulars varying depending on who was telling it. In some versions, Ella was a kind of local hero. In some, she was merely an example of legal diligence. She did not correct any version because the actual version was simply, she had known her rights and held to them, and that was sufficient. In 1889, the county had a new kind of community gathering, a harvest celebration that was less a polite welcome-back supper and more an actual festival, with music and food and competitions and a significant portion of the county's population in attendance. Ella and Emmett went together, with James on Emmett's shoulders most of the evening and Clara in Ella's arms. Martha Holloway was there, older now and slower but with the same clear eyes, and she found them near the food tables and looked at their family with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. "I told you," Martha said to Ella. "The quiet ones, thorough." Ella laughed. "You told me," she agreed. "How is he?" "He is exactly himself," Ella said, which was the highest compliment she had. Martha looked at Emmett, who was lifting James off his shoulders and setting him down so the boy could run toward the sound of the fiddle. "He looks happy," Martha said. "He is," Ella said. "We are." It was true, and it was not a simple truth. They had had hard seasons. A bad drought in 1886 that had cost them cattle and money and sleep. A sickness that swept through the county in the winter of 1887 that took 2 people Ella had known and left her, and Emmett nursing James through a lesser version of it for a terrifying 10 days. They had had the ordinary disagreements of 2 people living closely, the moments when his silence felt like distance, and the moments when her stubbornness felt like a wall, and they had learned to say so, to name the thing rather than let it accumulate. That was perhaps the deepest thing she had learned about him and about herself in relation to him, that the saying of difficult things to him was possible, and that when she said them he did not collapse or retaliate but simply took them seriously and responded with the same honesty. She had not known that was a thing marriages could be. She had not known she deserved it. Now she did. On the evening of the harvest celebration, when James was asleep on a blanket under the wagon and Clara was drowsing against Ella's shoulder, and the fiddle was playing a waltz that floated out over the crowd, Emmett found her at the edge of the light and held out his hand. "Will you dance with me?" he asked. She shifted Clara to her other arm and took his hand, and they danced slowly, the way you danced with a baby sleeping against your shoulder, more a swaying than a proper dance. And she felt the warmth of his hand at her back and the warmth of Clara's weight on her front and the sounds of the gathering around them, the fiddle and the voices and the laughter of children running in the dark. "6 years ago," she said, close to his ear so she did not have to raise her voice over the music, "you were standing in the corner of Harding's barn and I noticed you because you were the only man there who didn't come tell me what to do." He smiled. She felt it against her hair. "What did you think?" he asked. "At the time, I thought you were interesting," she said. "I thought I wanted to know what kind of man stands in a corner and doesn't offer an opinion." "The quiet kind," he said. "The thorough kind," she said, because Martha's word had always seemed more accurate. He pulled back enough to look at her, and his face was the face she had been looking at for 6 years, familiar and still surprising, the gray eyes steady and completely hers. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "That night," he said, "the gathering, I did notice you. You gave no indication of it. I know. But I noticed you, and I thought that you were the only person in that room who was entirely herself, with all those people telling her what to be. I thought that was one of the finest things I'd seen in a long time." She looked at him. "I was working up to introducing myself," he said, "but then you left before the dancing started." She laughed quietly, low enough not to wake Clara. "I was tired," she said. "I know," he said. "And then you came into the mercantile and I nearly walked into you and I thought, there she is again. And I thought that might be the world telling me to pay attention." "Did you believe the world talked to you that way?" she asked. "I started to," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the baby between them, the music turning around them in the warm Texas night. The stars were out in abundance, the kind of brilliant that only happened when the air was clear and the moon had not risen yet, and the land around them was dark and enormous and theirs. "I'm glad you paid attention," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." They stayed until the music stopped, and then they carefully collected James, who woke up enough to walk to the wagon on his own legs with his eyes mostly closed, and they drove home in the dark on the familiar road, the children asleep in the wagon bed, the horses knowing the way. The house was warm from the wood stove's banked coals when they got in, and they put the children to bed and went about the small rituals of the end of a good day. She braided her hair at the mirror, and he sat on the edge of the bed and took his boots off, and she watched him in the mirror, and he caught her watching and raised an eyebrow. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just looking." "Looking at what?" "You," she said. "My life, this." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Is it what you thought it would be? When you came back here, when you came back to Millhaven and decided to build something?" She thought about it honestly, because he always expected honest answers. She thought about the 30-year-old woman she had been, riding home from Harding's barn in the dark, tired and slightly raw from an evening full of other people's certainty about what she should do. She thought about what she had wanted, not what she had said she wanted, not the proper answer, but the real one. She had wanted exactly this. She had wanted to be known, specifically and fully. She had wanted to be alongside someone, not managed by them. She had wanted her land and her own mind and someone to sit with at the end of the day who was genuinely, completely in the room with her. "Yes," she said, "it is exactly what I thought it would be." He looked at her with the real smile, the one she had counted from the beginning. "Good," he said. "Come to bed." She crossed the room and turned down the lamp, and in the dark the last thing she heard before sleep was the sound of the Texas wind through the live oaks her grandfather had planted, moving the way it had always moved, the way it would move long after all of them had become part of the ground they loved so completely. And she thought, in that last warm moment before sleep took her, "I came back to figure out how to live, and I found that I already knew. I just needed someone beside me who knew it too. Outside, the stars were everywhere and the land was still, and the house was full of the breathing of people who belonged to one another. Not by obligation, not by necessity, by choice every single day. That was the thing she had learned, the real thing, the thing no one in Harding's barn had told her and no one could have, that the best things were not advised into existence. They were recognized. She had recognized him across a crowded barn. He had recognized her too. And everything else was just the living of it, which was, in all its hard and golden ordinary dailiness, everything. In the spring of 1891, James started at Miss Ford's school, and he walked to the road himself to meet the other children from the neighboring properties who made the daily walk to town together. And Ella stood on the porch and watched him go with the feeling that was specifically a mother's feeling, which was pride and grief and love combined into something that had no simpler name. Emmett stood beside her with his coffee. "He'll be fine," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not worried about him." "What are you aware," she said, "of time, of how fast it goes?" He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, watching the small dark-haired boy disappear around the bend in the road with his lunch pail swinging. "We'll have more mornings," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm glad for them all, even this one." Clara appeared behind them at the door, 2 years old and impatient and clutching a wooden horse that Emmett had made for her over the winter. She said, with the particular imperious clarity of a 2-year-old who has not yet learned that the world does not organize itself around her schedule, "Breakfast." Emmett turned and picked her up and she grabbed the collar of his shirt and pointed toward the kitchen, fully in charge of the morning. "Breakfast," he agreed and carried her inside. Ella turned from the road and followed them into the warmth of her house, her family, her life that she had built herself and tended daily, in the country she had always loved, alongside the man she had chosen freely and completely. The door closed behind her. The live oaks turned in the spring wind. The road was golden and long and theirs.